do you attribute intent to Mr. Trudeau? Do you think that some of these policies are just mistaken, that he just makes a bad call? Do you think that there's a plan by, like, what do you attribute when you look at the policies that you disagree with? Like, he comes into office early on. Do you think he knows the consequences of his actions? Do you think he knows the mistakes or the fallout that's going to occur? Do you think that he's a thoughtful person? You mentioned earlier that you don't really respect him. Do you think you sit down with him and you really try and understand his philosophy, what's going on behind the scenes? Where do you think you get in that conversation?
No, I don't think there's any point in talking to him. I don't think there's any point in listening to him. I don't think that anything he says is true or thoughtful or sincere. I think that he's an actor playing a role, and fundamentally he's not a thoughtful person. I think he kind of has like the knee-jerk liberal reaction to everything. And he's smug about it. So he thinks that he's smarter than you, and he thinks that he's better than you because he has these enlightened left-wing views, and he has this like French pedigree. And really, he doesn't have a lot of respect for the Canadian people. When I hear him talk, I just think he's full of it, that he's delivering talking points. I mean, if you've ever seen the guy in the House of Commons, when Conservatives are trying to hold him accountable, and you see how he will say the exact same words over and over and over again. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but he's done this in the House of Commons from the time he got elected, where they will be pressing him on a scandal, and he will literally just say the exact same thing over and over and over again. He'll do it to the media as well. It's so disrespectful.
I mean, it's fair to say that Pierre does the exact same thing, bring it home. Like, he's got his slogans and his lines just as much as Mr. Trudeau does. And Mr. Trudeau's in power, so he should be held accountable and he should try and answer questions. But politicians in general are bad for coming out with lines and not having a conversation like we're having, where we kind of get into the issues and try and have a meaningful conversation.
Fair, yes. Politicians are like, I would never be a politician because I can't do that. I can't just lie and say the same thing over and over again. And I don't like that. Sometimes I'll have a debate with a friend or with my husband over, whether Pierre Poilievre is a force for good for the things that we believe in. And sometimes it's disheartening because he'll have to say something and you're like, I don't know if he agrees with that, or if he's just saying that because he's a politician and he has to say that. And I completely agree that they do that, and that they all have their talking points, and that they have their slogans, and that's part of the game. But what I'm talking about, and maybe you've not seen this phenomenon, is that they will ask Justin Trudeau the same question 14 times in House of Commons, and he will literally say the exact same thing. He will say the exact same 20 words in response. It doesn't matter the way they ask the question. Let's reframe it. Let's ask it a different way. And he'll be like many Canadians, I spent the Christmas holiday with friends. And it's like, well, do you think it's right that you went to Jamaica and that you did this? Was it out of touch? Justin Trudeau. Like many Canadians, I spent Christmas holiday with friends. And it's like, and he'll do it over and over and over again. And it's like, are you kidding me? Are you serious? Like, this is how you're going to engage in a conversation? I've never seen a politician, any stripe, any party, any country, I've never seen them show that level of disrespect where they won't engage. They won't actually listen to the question. They won't even come up with a slightly different variation of a way to say it. They will literally just say the exact same thing until you just shut up and move on to the next topic. And I think that shows such a level of disrespect to the person asking the question, whether it's a reporter or an opposition parliamentarian. And deeper, it shows such a level of disrespect to the Canadian public. And maybe you don't see it because they'll just clip him. And if you just see the clip, you're like, oh, well, whatever. He answered the question. And it's like, no, he really didn't. Right. And like, fine, politicians play a role, and he doesn't want to say anything that will get him into trouble. And he holds a party line, and he has all the people around him terrified, and no one speaks out. No one criticizes him. And if they ever do, it becomes a big scandal. Like, oh my gosh, this Liberal MP said this thing. And like, let's all hold that Liberal MP to account. How dare you criticize the Prime Minister? And then let's move on. It's like, the amount of disrespect that he showed to so many different groups of Canadians over the years. And like, no, I never expect a level of accountability from Trudeau. I don't think he's capable of it. When I hear him on TV or I hear him on the radio, I'm baffled that Canadians take him seriously. Seriously, I think that he is one of the most arrogant, superficial people that I've ever had the experience of interacting with. And I think it's been like that a long time. Look, I've known the guy for a long time. He was actually a teacher at my brother's high school when we were teenagers. And I had the exact same opinion of him back then when I was a teenager. Like, I thought he was a superficial snake. And like, he hasn't changed. So it's like, yeah, that's who he is. He kind of looks like a movie star, and he came to power with these like grandiose ideological ideas about how Canada could be better. And people bought into that dream and that idea. And he was always kind of like shoving the celebrity part down our face. Like, why do you have 50% women in your cabinet? Because it's 2015. Like, that's not an answer, right? It's like, we're trying to wonder, we're wondering, like, why did you elevate a lot of these women that don't really have experience, but just because they checked a box, or they, it looks good to have 50% women, 50% men. And a lot of people just swoon over that. Like, oh, it's progress. Oh, it's amazing. There's a lot of us that are just sort of more skeptical about that. Like, no, we live in a meritocracy. And if 22% of your MPs are women, but then you're making 50% of the cabinet, that means you're promoting a lot of people superficially, not based on their experience, but just based on their gender. Is that really the best way to organize a government? And he never really had to answer for that. The result was that he had a lot of very incompetent female cabinet ministers who failed, who went up in smoke. He threw them under the bus, and they're long gone now. And it's like, he only ever get the credit for that. He never had to be held accountable, because the people around him, not just like his own staff and his own people, but, the liberal establishment around him, the media, that were just so moved by him and so touched by him and loved the idea of a feminist prime minister. They just accepted it and went along with it. And it's like, now it's been 8 years, and a lot of people can see through it, and they're like, well, they're not really that feminist. Like, look at the way they keep throwing female cabinet ministers under the bus and completely disrespecting them. And look at all the hypocrisy around their policy when it comes to, they say that that again, they're feminists and that everything they do leads to feminism. But then they also refuse to say women. Like, one of their MPs was giving a speech in the House of Commons about people who menstruate and people who have babies, people who are pregnant. It's like, they won't even say the word woman. It's such a farce. So again, I mean, we could spend a lot of time analyzing Justin Trudeau and his personality, but I just think he's one of the worst people to ever lead a country.
The only part that I want to push back on a little bit is the reason I asked the question was because I actually think it would be incredibly interesting to see a person like yourself sit down with him. I watched all of the interviews he did with CBC, CTV, like the various pundits that did it around the Christmas season. And I thought they did a good job. I think they did do some pushback on, like, hey, look at the economy. Hey, look at the likelihood of getting housing. Hey, look at these issues. How do you feel? And I agree with you. No sincerity in the answer. No, hey, you know what? Maybe we could have gotten started on housing sooner. Hey, maybe we should have done A, B, or C better. Maybe we made some mistakes. We could do better. None of that. But it would be so interesting to see a person like yourself who's really able to dive into the issues, sit down with him and watch him perhaps blunder that interview, or just see him put under a fire where all of those people are maybe worried about growing within their organization. They're worried about coming across as professional. They're worried about not pushing too hard. A person like yourself sitting down, I just feel like as a viewer, I'd be very interested in someone who has all of this deep analysis, who's written 2 books on his immigration work, sit down with him and really just try and get an answer beyond the superficial. And he might not give that, but that would even be more fascinating to me, to see that kind of back and forth.
Yeah, and look, back when Justin Trudeau first came onto the political scene as Liberal leader, I tried to interview him. I reached out. I asked for interviews. When I worked at Sun News, sometimes, not me personally, but some of my colleagues would have to like follow him in an event and try to ask him questions. But he's never been one to take questions from opposition-minded people. He would never sit down with someone like me. And I don't want to sound like too jaded and cynical. Like, I would never even bother talking to him. Yeah, if they called me up and they were like, "Hey, Candice, do you want to interview the Prime Minister?" I'd be like, "Yes." I'd get on a plane like in a few hours, and I would go and I would interview him, and it would be great. I would appreciate the opportunity, but I don't think he would ever do it. And I'll give you an example. In the 2019 election, we tried to put a journalist, a True North journalist, onto the Liberal campaign. to be embedded. So during an election, media companies can pay money, have a journalist that goes along on the campaign trail with a party. So you pay like $20,000 and they get to go on the plane or they get to go on the bus and they get all the access to go to every event and they cover the campaign that way. And it was like the first time True North was pretty new at that point, but the people that I had working for me were established legacy media, mainstream media journalists, people who had experience working at Global and Post Media and all these other. And Trudeau's people just said, like, absolutely not. You're not allowed. You're not allowed at our events, and we'll kick you out and we'll have the police, and like, you can't come. And I got in my car and I drove to Hamilton to meet with his press secretary because I was like, what do you mean we can't come cover the event? We're journalists and this is Canada. It's a free country. Like, let us in. And he just kind of gave us like a snaky, smarmy answer, like, well, you guys are conservative or whatever. And it's like, you know what, you let a journalist from like the National Observer, which is a very known left-wing outlet, you let them on. Like, what's the difference? Why can't you let someone who's more like on the political right? And they didn't have a good answer. And it just became pretty evident to me that they didn't have respect for journalists unless they were willing to toe the party line. Like I said, like,
are you worried about that at all with Pierre Poilievre? Because he has been pretty against doing things uniquely in the very opposite direction with more smaller organizations that are willing to interview him, but he has not been as interested in doing the, I would say, maybe legacy media approach, and he's been kind of accused of the same thing, but just almost in the exact reverse.
Yeah, I think it's a taste of their own medicine. I'm not going to sit here and just demand like principle all around. I think that the way that the contempt that the legacy media has for conservatives, not just conservative politicians, but conservative people, conservative outlets, like the way that they treat the Rebel News, like they'll go to a press conference and the Trudeau thugs will kick out the Rebel reporter, and the rest of the journalists will just be like, "Oh, good, okay, good." And it's like, you don't have some fundamental principle where you believe in journalism for a democracy. You don't care. You're like, well, they're a rebel. I don't care about that. And so, like, I'm not going to turn around and all of a sudden.
But you're doing the same thing in the reverse.
Yeah, well,
you're playing the same thing in reverse, which is just going to perpetuate the same problem.
No, I'm saying that for like 40 years, the mainstream media has shown derision and has absolutely ruined the lives of so many conservative politicians by just being absolutely cruel and like tormenting them. And for a conservative politician to finally stand up to those people in the media who have a tremendous amount of power, right? Like that whole thing when Pierre Poilievre smacked down that Canadian press reporter and just said, what you're saying isn't true. I said this. What you're saying is wrong. Stop trying to drum up a scandal. And everyone made it like a huge deal. Like, oh, this is a person of power going after someone smaller than them. It's like, no, these these reporters wield a great deal of power. And they use that power to smear conservatives. And we see it during every single election. And so if you finally have a politician on the conservative side willing to stand up and just say, no, actually, you're wrong. What you're saying is lying. You're not true. Like, this is fake. I'm going to stand up to you and I'm going to say that. Like, I think all the power to that politician, like, Canadians can judge them and view them how they will. And obviously, I think journalism is an important foundation of a democracy and of a free society. But from my perspective, Aaron, I've watched like liberals manipulate this process, manipulate the media for so long and use it as a tool, a part of the Liberal Party. Like, next time there's an election, watch it, follow it, see how whatever the Liberal talking point of the day, the mainstream media turns into the narrative of that day. Like, oh, we're all going to attack Andrew Scheer now because he said he was an accountant, but he actually had this different qualification that means that he wasn't a full accountant. We're going to spend 4 days of the campaign drilling in on whether Andrew Scheer was actually an accountant. It's like, is that really the issue that Canadians care about that's going to impact like the country? And instead of like talking about the millions of scandals surrounding the Liberal government, the media obsesses over whether Andrew Scheer, what his Catholic beliefs are around sin. Like, we're going to focus on that. It's like whatever the Liberals want, the mainstream media will just like pounce on that. And we're getting to a point now where people just don't trust the media. They don't want that. They don't like it. The media has less power now than they've ever had. There's so many podcasts out there that get just as many, if not more views than the CBC. And so it's like, at the end of the day, it's up to Pierre Poilievre which podcasts he wants to do. If he wants to be disrespectful to the CBC and say, look, if I win, I'm not going to fund you guys anymore. I mean, that's his prerogative, right? That's as a politician, he can do that. Canadians can judge him and say, well, I don't like the fact that he's mean to the CBC, so I'm not going to vote for him. But for every Canadian that makes that judgment call, there might be another Canadian that says, you know what, I like the fact that Pierre Poilievre went on a 2-hour podcast with Jordan Peterson and had like a real conversation in a down-to-earth way and talked about things that were broader than just talking points in politics. They had a conversation about like life and meaning and philosophy. And a lot of people will like really appreciate, they'll get a lot more from an in-depth sit-down conversation with Poilievre than they will with like, you know, these end of year interviews that you're talking about that are like 10 minutes, highly scripted. Yeah. Exactly. You could tell exactly what's going to happen before they're written. They all ask the same questions. They all focus on the same topics that are probably not the same topics that you're talking about with your family around the dinner table about what really matters in your community. But the media have decided that those are the important questions, and they're all based on Trudeau's agenda. They're all based on the things that he wants to talk about. And that's the way it goes. I think the landscape is changing. And so just to go back to, I know you're trying to like push me and get me to admit that somehow there's a contradiction between the fact that Trudeau's being disrespectful to the mainstream, or sorry, that Poilievre is being disrespectful to the mainstream media in the same way that Trudeau was disrespectful to the alternative or the independent media. It's like, well, one of these groups has all the power, right? The legacy media is incredibly powerful. And so the fact that Poilievre is threatening that power, that's part of Poilievre's political brand, right? It's like, I'm going to go after these gatekeepers. There's like a handful of people in society that have a lot of power, and I don't think that's right. So I'm going to go after them. I'm going to challenge them. He obviously still does interviews with them. Like he's still there. He's talking to them. He's not completely ignoring them. He's not having them arrested the same way that Trudeau is having he had Andrew Lawton arrested, my journalist. He said David Menzies arrested like 10 times over at the Rebel. Like, I think there's a difference in kind between what's happening. And I mean, I don't know if you want to keep talking about this, we can. But I think it's good that Pierre is pushing back against legacy media.
Sorry, I apologize. I'm not trying to encourage any sort of contradiction. What I guess my perspective is more that when I watched that Jordan Peterson, Pierre Poilievre video with great excitement because I was interested in what was going to come out of that. And I think if you agree with everything that they think, that was a good interview. My frustration is the thing I actually admire about Pierre is he's willing to take it to people. He's been described as a bulldog. He's been described as somebody who's willing to take it to people. Yet he doesn't do that. And I would want to see him go into the fire, do a long form CBC interview with the exact organization he wants to take away, and discuss defunding the CBC with a CBC journalist about how that process would look and why he's warranted in doing that, and bring in their best reporter, bring in the person with all the statistics, and let him go toe to toe with the best of them. And I don't say that because I get if you look at it through a conservative liberal lens, you would have this, well, 40 years, the conservatives had this happen to them because of the liberals. I personally don't care about that. What I want to see in an ideal Canada is that my leader is the person who's willing to speak with anyone about anything and stand by their principles no matter what. And seeing Pierre repeat some of the same things in the reverse is just frustrating because it feels like that's going to be a liberal talking point. That's the CBC's talking point now. Oh, he's not willing to do that. And so Justin Trudeau is encouraged to do exactly what he's doing because Pierre is doing the exact thing in the opposite direction. And when I put my ballot in, I have the same concerns as you when I think about, did he say that? Did he mean it? Is he changing his look because he wants to? Is he doing it for the votes? Is that what we want to see? Like, I get very idealistic when I start thinking about politics, that I just want the best person, the most admirable individual to lead our country and to go and sit down in conversations. And when I see him choosing to do this, I get from a political perspective how it might gain support. But personally, I just want to see that person be admirable and go into the exact situations he's put Justin Trudeau in, grilling him about how he approached the SNC-Lavalin scandal and all of those things. I want him to be able to take that back and go, hey, I can dish it out, but I can take it too. And that's the only fear that I have around this whole concept around how he's not doing those interviews. I would just see that as personally admirable.
Like, okay, there's a video that went viral that he was out in Kelowna, I think, and he was on an apple orchard and he was getting, we're talking about Pierre Poilievre here. Yeah. There was a reporter that was like, you're taking a page from the Trump playbook. And he's like, what are you talking about? What playbook? What page? Right? And it's like, we do see those interviews. We see those advertisements.
That's not a real hard, like, that's not you if you sat down with Justin Trudeau pushing him. This is a guy who clearly knew nothing. Like, the ones that go viral for Pierre are thoughtless, like, morons asking a question that they don't actually understand, asking it. It's not the best of the creme de la creme asking him a tough question, being able to really dissect it and break it down. I watch a lot of the UFC, and Dana White does the same thing. He'll interview somebody and somebody will ask some thoughtless question about his thoughts on LGBTQ people, and he'll give like a smirky answer that goes viral, but it's not actually like a thoughtful, like, okay, break down, how would we do this with the CBC, or how are we going to cut that red tape? Really break it down for me. Like, he doesn't do that same where it's like with somebody who disagrees with him, really going through it. Those are easy clickbait kind of videos that I like. I think it's kind of cool to see somebody eating an apple, destroying somebody, but it's not in depth. I just saw Ben Shapiro do an interview and with Destiny, and it was like a thoughtful, thorough interview where they disagreed on some things. And that's, I don't think those easy ones where it's eating an apple are examples of him being truly grilled by somebody.
Yeah, but like the point that we were talking about earlier is that he's not willing to do the interviews, but I think he is willing. Like, the fact that we see him at press conferences getting scrummed by the media.
Fair.
I mean, that's who they're sending, right? That's who the media
Fair.
organizations are sending those journalists. So if they can come up with a better journalist that can come, I mean, if you have someone in mind that you say, like, there's a really smart liberal journalist out there who has a podcast, who's like really thought things through, I want to see that person interview Pierre Poilievre. Like, I don't know Pierre that well. I've interviewed him a few times on my show, and let me tell you, when I have him on my show, I don't ask him easy questions. I really push him on the things that I disagree with him on, and then I give him a platform to talk about the things that I think that he's doing a good job with. So it's not necessarily an adversarial interview, but it's an in-depth interview. You know, he was on my show. I think we talked for over an hour, and you know, I think that that's something that I really like about Pierre. Previous conservative leaders haven't done that with me. I don't think a lot of politicians feel comfortable. Pierre is unique in that way. But I'll just give you an example, Aaron. The previous leader of the Conservative Party, Aaron O'Toole, he did a podcast with the CBC. He did like a 20-minute interview. And there was a section where they were talking about defunding. And Aaron O'Toole talked about why he believed that the CBC was beyond its mandate and that it shouldn't get the funding. And the CBC edited that out. They cut it out. So they put the interview on their website, but they cut out that 5-minute part. Like, we're not dealing with an honest actor here. We're not dealing with like if I watch this interview that we're doing right now and I think it's like deceptively edited, I would be like really surprised, because I'd be like, that's like a low thing to do, right? You just assume you're doing a podcast, you're doing an interview, they're going to put it all up.
It's all going to be up, I promise.
Yeah, exactly. I know, because that's like how normal people operate. I mean, like normal people just do what they say they're going to do, and they try to be good, honorable people. And the fact that the CBC did that, I'm not saying it was the journalist who conducted the interview's fault. It was probably some editor or some executive or some person that was like, nope, that's not part of our programming, and we're not going to allow that rationale to be out there. We don't want to be a platform for someone who's going to say that we shouldn't get this money. And so they just cut it out. And it's like, well, when you're doing that, you're not really doing things in the interest of the public anymore. You're doing things in the interest of the CBC. And I think that you know, you say like, oh, I don't care about the 40-year history of them being unfair to conservatives. It's like, well, that's fine. But there are certain things that have happened that lead to you being skeptical, or you being cynical, or you saying, you know, I'm not going to sit down with the CBC because I know you guys and I know what you're going to do. And I'm not speaking for Pierre. I think that he should do as many interviews as possible, and that he should, you know, try to put himself out there in a way that Canadians can see that he's different than Trudeau, and that he's not just like a superficial career politician, that he has some substance and he's thought things through, and that he will do a good job. And that's part of what he's out there doing right now. It's like a 2-year job interview, right? He's auditioning for the role of prime minister, and Canadians have a lot of time to look at him and decide whether or not he has the character and he has the traits that we want to lead. I think that we're at a point where a lot of people are just completely exhausted with Trudeau. Yeah. I can't imagine Trudeau going forward. So, you know, it's good that we have an alternative. I don't think he's perfect. There's a lot of things I disagree with him on. But I think that when it comes to his style and his combativeness and his willingness to, you know, tell someone that they're wrong, that's almost like unique in Canada, because we're such a polite society and we're so timid, and usually it's all about conventions and politeness, and you don't see a politician doing that. You never saw the previous leader, Aaron O'Toole, or Andrew Scheer before him, or even really Stephen Harper. You didn't see them really calling a spade, whereas Pierre's doing that, and it's sort of refreshing from my perspective.